Chapter 2. Rukali had woken before they landed. The pull of gravity began to bring him a sickening sensation. They were approaching a planetary body of some kind and slowing their descent, but the cargo hold where the locked pods were being kept was still dark, and no movement could be detected from his limited view. How long had he been asleep? He doubted it had been too long, but it wasn't easy to know for certain when there was no light or sound. Abruptly, all that changed as the brightest light he had ever witnessed struck his eyes with the sensation that could only be described as pain, disorienting him as the uncomfortable feeling of gravity was embraced in full and he experienced a moment of free fall. His medical pod was roughly dumped onto the sand-covered soil, tumbling for a few units before throwing him out as it came to a hard stop against a large rock. Beyond the bruises, it provided him with a sense of déjà vu that he did not particularly appreciate. Waking up dazed and confused to crawl out of a pod was something he had gone through enough of for several lifetimes at this point. The crashing of other impacts signaled that he wasn't alone, and he lay on his back watching them slip from the craft above. The final object released was a large, heavy crate, easily 30 times his medical pod in size, which slammed into the ground to shake the soil in a final, somber tone. As Rukali got to his feet, he surveyed the area, checking himself for any injuries. There were none. The familiar buzz of nanites was still humming a symphony in the background as he picked himself up, renewed with a vigor he hadn't expected. It paired up well with the fading groan of a military ship lifting off to approach an angle for re-entering orbit, its metallic hull catching the first rays of dawn as the red sun lifted over the foreign horizon. The world, as Rukali perceived it, almost seemed to vibrate with the combination. The second dose that had been given to him upon pickup was sticking around a lot longer than normal. He had probably gone over the normal dosage for a being of his mass, likely 5 to 6 times at a rough count. He had no idea the concentrations that had been used. Rukali had never heard of someone being foolish enough to try this before, but he felt fine, better than fine actually. It wasn't as though he was the one going out and injecting himself. He just kept winding up in unfortunate situations where people felt he needed it. As he stretched his legs, he marveled at how strong he felt. Throughout the entire affair on that ship, none of them had even been let out of their medical containment. When he had been conscious, which was only for short periods, he heard enough going on to have been glad this was the case. His military tagging implants had identified him, but those outside of the pod had not been interested in much of anything but instructing him on the conditions of his incarceration. The fact that he was Rukali Bulsorg, first commander of the 33rd Line, leader of the Outer Shell and enforcer of the Code, was irrelevant. A humbling situation. From the best he could understand, it seemed that a civil war had broken out, and he had the wonderful luck of being in a ship on the losing side. It was something to be grateful for that the ship had apparently surrendered peacefully once they had run out of alternative options. Rukali distinctly remembered a glimpse of Sika troops prowling through the chamber as a Gastruka burped out the terms of their unconditional surrender. He heard the screams as the Sika did what they did best, and the begging as a select few survivors were dragged off. Any resistance at all, it appeared, was futile. The pod had seemed like a blessing then. Rukali took a deep breath of air. His muscles were something different entirely, and the contrast almost threw him off balance. Ridiculously strong. His body felt as though it were made of steel. Experimenting, he attempted to lift the medical pod cover, the dense glass piece that had broken free from the larger portion upon his rough landing. "Are you all right, Commander?" A formal greeting rang out over the dry air, the sounds in his mind translated to standard Union tongue, while the echoes rippled off in foreign reverberations. Rukali turned to see a Mintrock trekking up the hill along a track line that had been cut into the soil. Apparently her medical pod hadn't had the misfortune of rolling to a stop. She was of medium build, shorter than most species, and easily 2 feet shorter than himself. As was common with most Mintrocks, she wore no combat suit and simply had a bandolier and belt that matched her olive-toned shell. A series of long cracks ran down her chitinous plates from a rough impact. The engineering talisman was shattered and refused, staggering its image. Vaguely, Rukali remembered her as the sharpshooter from the walls. "In all likelihood, I've been demoted, engineer, though I appreciate the sentiment." Rukali let the dense glass slip from his fingers as he straightened his back to return the formal gesture. "I don't believe I ever got your name during our last meeting." "Hiko, Commander. Union Orbital Reserve, 2nd class." Her shell pieces clattered against themselves as she turned to check the others, stumbling, falling, or simply rolling out of their pods with groans of discomfort. "So are they, for the most part, sir." Rukali brushed his combat suit of sand. "I don't suppose you have any details on what we're doing here?" The Mintrock paused as her jaws parted to taste the air. "Well, I remember that ship crashing into the base, but not much afterwards. Took a nasty fall before that even happened." Another pause with a scoff that seemed to indicate distaste. "I remember being rescued." She clicked her mandibles in thought. "Union squad pulled us off of the planet." "Then why are we planet-side again?" Rukali found his face shifting in discomfort as he peered off into the distance. Sand dunes, dust storms, and a red sun were practically all that greeted him beyond the rising temperatures and the slow wind. Turning back to the close at hand, he surveyed the mess around him. Something was ringing true as recognition, but he wasn't quite certain what it was. He hadn't been here before. Where it was. "I would have expected that we would be held as prisoners at the very least." There were 15 other medical units scattered about the dune, each with their occupants groggily pulling themselves up and out of their respective pods. As they hiked up the slope, Rukali took notice of one individual specifically. Unlike the others, it had already made it up the hill and was prying at the locking mechanism on the supply crate. An Oxot, and a large one, Rukali recognized the posture of a soldier. More apparently, he recognized the Union's inner system emblem, branded on its arm alongside 2 linear dashes. A veteran, promoted through combat to the rank of field leader. A field leader that was growing more desperate with each massive shove against the crate's locking mechanism. "Soldier!" Rukali shouted up the hill as he dug in to jog up the rest of the way. "Awaiting status report, field leader." The Oxot barely gave him a glance as its muscles bulged, forcing the jamming metal to give bit by bit. "We're all dead if I can't get this open. That's your status report, whoever you are." The metal gave, and the heavy crate was pried open with a grunt as the Oxot shoved, muscles flexing under strain and reptilian scales. Inside was a vehicle, a Landstrider, one of the few mechanical units that still relied upon wheeled transport. Military antique in this day and age, a surplus relic. The Oxot voiced his complaint immediately. "They don't want any of us to fracking survive, then!" His colors shifted in swirls of anger as his scales reflected his emotions. "That's that. We're dead." Rukali walked into the crate and surveyed the gear supplied. There wasn't much. That was crystal clear. Outside of the 6-wheeled relic, there was a single container of ration pellets and a few barrels of liquid, only 2 of which appeared to be water. The others were labeled as a liquid fuel source. Even as he performed a walkthrough of the vehicle, Rukali had a very hard time not agreeing with the field leader. Someone indeed wanted them to die, at least a majority of them. Where the hell were they, anyways? He exited the container, leaving the Mintrock engineer to inspect the vehicle. As Rukali felt the heat of the sun on his face, he brought up a hand to cover his eyes from the light as they adjusted. There weren't many soldiers in the group. From his view on uniforms alone, most had actually come from the planet with him in the Mintrock and were Union engineers. The three that were soldiers were gathered together, discussing in hushed tones. As Rukali approached, what reached his ears hissed of urgency as their panic leaked into their conversation. All of them were Oxot, though the field leader took half a head taller than the other two, each of which bore the infantry unit brands on their scales.
It was a Senate squad, Gastruka lead. I could never sleep in those fracking pods. I heard everything.
The field leader hushed his voice, his tongue flicking into view.
We're on Attica.
You can't be serious. How in the void did they get away with that?
They slapped some bogus charge, labeled us as traitors. 20 planetary rotation sentence. We're on the wrong side of whatever the frack started when we landed. You all heard what they did to the crew that resisted.
I didn't hear anything. The shot that took me out planet side kept me out. When I woke up, all I saw was that death squad. The smallest of the three spoke quickly. Some of those Sika troopers through the glass when I woke up the first time. Evil things, those ones.
What do you expect? They're full carnivorous. Only reason they're in the Union is because they're Senate pets. They make problems go away.
The field leader's colors shifted to a deep black.
You ever heard of anyone surviving 20 days on Attica? Even if they do have some orbital drone watching us to signal for pickup at the end of this sentence and didn't just dump us here, our chances are slim to none.
A crack of thunder rocked the desert air as a flaming object streaked across the sky. Rukali could make out exhaust thrusts attempting to control the atmospheric entry as pieces of it broke off. An escape pod, and from recent memory, a Union military pod judging by its shape. Any further chance at details were lost as the fiery streak blew past them to crash into the distance, but several more blasts of noise and shock waves that lifted most of the group off of their feet announced that the pod was not alone. 19 more pods had launched and were screeching their way across the sky, creating interlocking trails of smoke and fire on their way down. Rukali bellowed a laugh as he pulled himself off of the ground, as clouds of sand and dust settled around them.
Well, I, for one, believe our chances have just improved, Field Leader.
Array Class Monitoring System. Coverage Zone 4. Group 3. Surviving members, full. Convicted 578043 through 578060. Class 12 Prison World. Attica. Sentence, death. 20 rotation commitment. Rotation 1. His neck itched again. As his hand touched the cool metal, he held it there, feeling the merge of skin and synthetic. It was a strange sensation, being able to feel through something that wasn't flesh. It felt wrong, artificial. There were times when it felt cold, hot, or tainted, like a sweat you couldn't wipe away, but the worst was when it itched. There was nothing he could do about it. It wasn't as though he could itch something made of metal, or even wipe away the sensation of tingling nerves that had fused with it. It was simply something to endure, a piece of him he had never wanted but received. In the still silence of the vehicle's cabin, he tried to resist the urge to scream in frustration. It would pass. It always did. Patience. If there was anything he had learned to accept, it was patience. The rustles of breathing, shifting forms, quiet rasps, the occasional click of chitin pieces against a seat. It was very strange, but peaceful. They had managed to fit quite a bit into what was essentially an alien version of a stretched-out monster truck. The craft was by far the closest thing to a human vehicle he had seen in a long time. The wheels, the metal, the controls, they were all unfamiliar, but they functioned for the same purposes. It reminded him of... No, that memory was a blank. A recognizable blank, the worst kind. The gap between knowledge and nothing, held to some form of limbo that may or may not be reachable if he thought long enough and tried from enough angles. He couldn't, though. Not this time. This time it was gone. His neck still itched. This was not shaping up to be a good night. The rage was back. With each pulse in his neck, he felt his anger rise into a fury, a flood, a red-visioned haze before he forced it back down. That would solve nothing. Contain it, channel it, use it to survive another day. There was a reason humans were capable of such anger, a reason for that rage. It was powerful. Compared to the other species in the cabin, the man knew he was dangerous. There were likely only two that could hope to match him, and they were in full combat suits. He had seen what he could do, remembered the gore vividly, like you remember being sick or ill. After moments of careful consideration, he decided even they wouldn't stand a chance. He was far too dangerous. You couldn't change the past, however blood-soaked it was. In the dark, he saw her eyes open, translucent-like things. They reminded him of some sort of polished gems that could catch the light and hold it in a way that was close to feline. A strange blue, an iris that filled the entire eye and not just the center. Those matched her scars. She had been dreaming of their escape from the ship. He knew that this wasn't something he should be capable of knowing, but was aware of it regardless. It had been more and more apparent recently. He felt her in his head as he caught some of the fleeting images blur past, together, and then dissipate. The escape pods, the waiting, the fear, the long stripe of discolored flesh on his back as muscles tensed to bring it to life. The terrible fall as they crashed down from space, surrounded by empty decoys. Confusion, panic, terror, fading into the background. She never dreamed of things that hadn't happened, only things that had. She was trapped on a linear pathway from start to finish. A slow, deliberate motion, the seat creaked softly and his feet silently glided across the floor. The rubber-like substance that coated the metal underbelly of the vehicle was warm and compressed ever so slightly under his weight. As he removed himself and left the cabin, the change in temperature hit him all at once, bringing him into heightened awareness as it chased off the last hint of his sleeping mind. It was a cool evening, like the deserts, Beck. The deserts. No, it was gone as well. Likely a memory of Earth. In his mind he felt a tugging, or gentle nudge of intention that signaled she was awake. He wasn't certain why she did this, be it out of something instinctive or an old habit she had never broken. He didn't care. If she had something to say, she could do it out loud. As he dropped down to the sandy soil, he felt alive and familiar with the dirt, the air, and the sky. He went from contained to expansive. As there suddenly were no boundaries, no restrictions, he could see for miles of desert sands, rolling dunes, tiny clouds, millions of stars. It wasn't so bad on the planet, at least when the storms had passed them and the other threats had gone. He had grown to appreciate the smaller things since being on the surface. He, unlike most of the species he encountered, had not lived for thousands of generations in space on specialized vessels. He had grown to full on solid ground, and it was reassuring to feel sand beneath his toes and roughened feet. She was still there, in the corner of his mind, ever present, like the beating of his pulse and the slight shifting in his vision that accompanied it. It wasn't something one would notice unless they knew to look for it, but it was there. If he thought back, he could recognize that she had been there a while, whether either of them had realized it or not. It made sense. The translator had made him too comfortable, too relaxed, at ease when he should have been on guard. These were not humans. They were something else, and his own experiences, his whole existence, was different from theirs. He was the foreign body here, the alien to their ways. Why had he even expected aliens to be remotely similar to himself? The fact that the sirens even had emotions he could recognize should really be a blessing, considering how different some of the other species he had seen were in comparison. Why wouldn't he find that they had some form of communication or bonding different than his own? The door creaked once more, and a soft landing announced that he had been followed. Yatal hit the sand with the grace of a cat as she stepped out into the light of the moon, which seemed to hold its place above in synchronicity of the planet orbit. As he turned to her, those gem-like eyes glowed blue again, utterly alien, different, and bizarre. "I'm sorry." Her song held more emotion than he was expecting, layered with octaves. "I know. I saw." A glimmer of color flashed in that tiny corner of his mind, a purple shaded with dark gray. Guilt seemed to fit. Sadness, maybe. "I saw a lot of things." "Then you know I didn't intend for this to happen." More gray, more purple streaks of white etched through them like bolts of lightning or cracks from strain. "For Void's sake, I thought you were a beast." Yatal's voice hung over the cold air in frost, a tiny cloud that dissipated with her confidence. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Her song grew hushed, emotion strained into it in a way that she had never quite managed before. It was a tone of acceptance. "What I did was wrong. What I tried to make you do was wrong, but you did it anyways, by choice."
"I'm not just a fucking contract, Yatal."
His eyes met those glowing blue pieces in anger.
"When you tried, out of desperation, I understand that now, but when you tried, did you see her?"
His voice was level.
"Did you see her, or did she slip past you like she does me?"
A tone of confusion hummed a simple pulse as Yatal walked out from the shadows of the vessel. "There were too many thoughts for me to see much of any one thing for more than an instant. Your mind was static, as if from 1,000 ships casting to one channel." They froze as a stray gust threw sand high into the air, forming a swirling pattern, a cyclone that cast a shadow on the surface below. It dissipated quietly, as quickly as it had arrived, the distant pattern of falling stones ringing off the quiet hills. Just another constant reminder of the danger, and how little they held control over it. "We shouldn't be out of the Strider during the night cycle." In the far distance, shapes moved along the peaks of giant dunes, prowling forms that seemed to absorb the light and not reflect it. "We've done well enough to avoid more conflicts, but we both know that we've been holding from those on the edge of your blade. We can't let our guard down."
"How long is it going to last, Yatal?"
"Until one of us is dead." The thought came back instantly, before a mix of colors tried to cover over the slip, a black shade of terror. As he sat down, he turned back to Yatal.
"You know, I hated you."
Another wafting cloud of vapor left his lips as it met the night air.
"From the pit of my soul, I hated you. But you need to know something, Yatal, here and now, something that I had presumed you understood, something that was crucial to my people, and I can only pray is relevant to your own. The worst criminals of my kind were those who harmed another. If I killed another of my kind, they would have called it murder. Beyond rape, there was no worse offense. Nothing worse you could do to another person."
He lay on the ground, feeling the cool sand against his back, against his scar, as he stared at the unfamiliar sky.
"I've killed others now. Not in the name of war or justice, but for the safety of you and your crew and myself."
A slow exhalation spewed a misty fog into the air above his face, blocking the reflected light of the distant moon.
"They might not have been human, but they were intelligent."
Another dust storm swirled closer, bringing with it a rattling of small stones which skipped off along the ground in a tiny stampede.
To kill in cold blood would be staining mankind's legacy.
The cold ground was comforting as he pulled his arms back behind his head and tried to make out stars through the foreign atmosphere.
If I'm really the only human left, that's on me to keep clean.
Yatal was quiet as she listened. From what she could understand through the link, which had been growing at a steady pace over the last few days, he wasn't lying. He had been as honest with her just now as he had when they had made their agreements to the contract. She wished she had been more certain on that issue beforehand, or she never would have pushed at the life bond in the first place and instead left it be. It wasn't as though she had known when first trying to kindle the connection. The human had just been a ship beast then, a creature intended for the sole purpose of protecting her crew and herself. Bonding with a beast was by no means the same thing as bonding to a being of intelligence, and the context was another issue entirely. She had known. Fracking hell, it was an uncomfortable situation. Siren, as a species, were not particularly strong or unreasonably intelligent. They were hard workers, creative, and quick learners, but they were not exceptional when compared to the galactic standards. During the early days of their membership in the Union, Siren trade ships had collared beasts like all the others. To defend their holdings, their crews, their very contracts, the shipmaster would find and tame a creature to act in their defense if the need arose. Back in those times, the need occurred far more often. If a crew consisted of Rula, Oxot, or some other fringe world species, the crew might be capable of defending themselves even without the assistance of a guardian. Most such species had a heritage of warrior bloodlines or some other similar military faction. Sirens, though, for those like themselves, well, they had nothing but what they had learned of those things from others. Unlike their fellow traders, Sirens lacked that heritage. What they had, they received from the Union, through the rare individuals that enlisted among the military and returned, like herself. The only reason their species had held its own against the threats of the fringe was through the role of the shipmaster and their life-bonded beasts. It wasn't a pretty method, but on the fringes, if you had an advantage, you needed to use it. Species capable of psionic abilities in the Union were rare, and of those that did possess the abilities, a majority of them weren't extremely talkative on the subject. In simplicity, it boiled down to the process of conditioning, of breaking a creature's spirit and forcing your mind upon theirs while it was weakened. Making the connection and then amplifying it as far as it could go, bending the beast to your will and providing a link that would last a lifetime. This was by no means what the ability had been evolved for, but it worked efficiently enough on creatures that fit the description of dumb intelligence to create a one-sided bond. Certainly a siren crew as a whole did not stand out as particularly dangerous, but when their Deathworld primal guardian beast had the backing of intelligence of a shipmaster directing its very thoughts, a siren vessel became a very deadly place for an invading force. Yital had never bonded a beast before. She supposed that was probably the first place she had gone wrong in this entire venture. She hadn't known what to expect from it, other than that it was different from being bonded to another like herself. That she had experienced, in full. She had lived it through to the end. The breaking of that bond was enough to make her never want another like it. Death was kind to no one.
Never has been and never will.
She flinched as the thought tapped her mind. Something harmless but present, a raindrop on glass, a fact of life.
The sun is rising. We'll need to move soon.
The human spoke aloud as he rolled to his feet, dusting off the crude fabric that held along his waist and legs.
7 more days.